Hi, my name is Caitlin Reeves Greenemeyer, and I am the archivist at Columbia Theological Seminary in Decatur, Georgia. Our campus is located on land that was historically the territory of Muskogee Creek and their predecessors, who suffered extensively from colonizers' greed, a series of false treaties, and hostile actions undertaken by white settlers. I want to acknowledge this tragedy and the uncomfortable fact that the forced removal of the Muskogee Creek is the reason we are able to occupy this land now. And I wish to honor the Indigenous people who preceded and still remain with us here. So thank you for joining us. I'm going to talk briefly about a mold outbreak in the archives and how I used the response to push forward a project I had been unable to complete due to several reasons, but the main one being low staffing numbers. So my story begins on a Friday in June 2020 with a call from my boss around 4:30 in the afternoon. And she said, "Caitlin, there's mold in the archives." The archives at Columbia Theological Seminary include the entire third floor of the library, which is about 6,000 square feet of material. And the material documents the history of the seminary, which is approaching its 200th anniversary. And it also includes the records and minutes of many historic Southern Presbyterian churches. So in June of 2020, my colleagues and I were primarily working remotely. However, we were going to campus maybe one time a week to answer reference questions, make scans, and because none of us were consistently coming to the building, we were unaware of the high humidity and temperature. While facilities was monitoring the HVAC system, the mechanics were actually operating differently than the output reports were indicating. So basically, it was hot and muggy inside the library. And because each of us were coming only once a week, nobody realized it. I feel very grateful that my boss, the library director, had previously dealt with mold situation. So she knew to contact Belfour, who arrived quickly on the scene and brought in large dehumidifiers and hung up some plastic sheeting to try and contain some of the mold. So the following Monday, I was nervous and kind of excited to go to campus. And like any good millennial trying to survive a global pandemic, I made a TikTok. So let me unplug my headphones. I think I'm losing my mind, trying to stay inside the lines. It's like you're running in place. How you keep staying the same. So I know it's not great production quality, but the point is to make sure that you document whatever situation you are in. This became incredibly important with insurance as well as advocating to administration for our decision making. So as you document, step number 2 would be to refer to the disaster plan. Or in my case, the disaster planning box. There were some brochures from the early 2000s in this planning box that had been distributed by NEDCC, and I found those very helpful in navigating to their website. So if you have no disaster plan, proceed to step 3, which for me was spending the next 48 hours learning everything I could about mold. I contacted NEDCC because I saw on their website that there had recently been a webinar on mold, and they were gracious enough to provide me access to the recorded webinar as well as the documentation from the webinar. So I am very grateful for their generosity and in the webinar and through the documentation, I learned that our outbreak was likely Aspergillus mold, which is a very common, and that our particular species, I guess, was a big fan of the binding made out of natural material, aka leather. So using their documentation, I also looked at what my next steps should be. So step 4 is complete a test run. It turns out I had access to an appropriate vacuum, so I proceeded to order some safety wear and run a test on how long it might take to clean the mold in the archives. Completing the test run gave me a basic idea of how long the cleaning of all of our leather-bound items would take, because we were still in the process of figuring out how we were going to move forward. And at the time, part of the test was to decide whether or not I should clean all of the materials, which in retrospect is just hysterical to think about. So like I said, the mold really liked any natural binding, like this leather volume on the right. And our collection from the 18th, 19th, and 20th century includes a lot of bound record books in very nice leather. So we decided we would contract with a mold remediation team to clean the bound material, because after I conducted my test and did some sampling of the amount of material that would need to be cleaned, we decided that would be the most efficient use of our time and money. And it seemed like the mold was not super crazy about the paper inside of the binding. So then there was the matter of the Presbyterian Women's History Collection, which consisted of over 5,800 congregations housed in binders like the one here on the left that is the mold has had a field day on. So the collection was started in the 1930s in an effort for the women of the church to preserve the history of their individual congregations. And I just want to point out that this initiative was likely born out of nostalgia for the Southern mythology of the lost cause narrative. But the women of the church submit history annually and have done so since the 1930s and continue to do so. So it's increasingly evolving and growing. And the collection fills in the gaps where church records have been lost and demonstrate the way women organize themselves in places that had no other like larger organization of women, like a junior league. But the collection, much to my annoyance and professional displeasure, has been housed in binders since the 1930s. So we thought, instead of cleaning every binder, we take this opportunity to move the collection to a more archivally sound medium. After all, the reason the mold flourished on this collection was because of how it was housed. So, inspired by this idea, step 5 is, drumroll, run the numbers. I ended up doing a lot of algebra in order to get an idea of how much it would cost to buy the supplies and the hours it would take to rehouse the material, and proposed to administration that we take this opportunity to not clean, but rehouse the collection. Partially because I was persuasive, but also because we were in an emergency triage situation. They gave us the green light. So that was one of my biggest takeaways from this whole craziness, was taking advantage of moments when things need to be done quickly. Unfortunately, it needed to be done quickly on my end as well. What would have been a more comfortable year's worth of planning turned into a month of planning, ordering several thousand boxes and folders. Which then leads to step 6, which is to test the process of rehousing this collection. The team that we were working with is not specifically trained in archives. So I needed to set up a process that required them to think very little and to just sort of plug and chug, to just do it. So I went through and separated all of the churches using colored pieces of paper so they would know, and they could just transfer the colored piece of paper from the box so that we could go back and label the boxes at a later time. So in February of 2021, while I was 11 weeks pregnant, they started the mold remediation rehousing project. And over a period of 6 weeks, while we were all trying to not give or get COVID, the team rehoused the individual histories of over 5,800 congregations. So their work has taken the collection from a moldy version of this to a satisfying gray rainbow of boxes. And my grad students are now in the process of relabeling the boxes. So the shelves have gone from the individual binders that looked like this to these beautifully labeled boxes. We're a small shop, so I spend the better part of my time triaging small situations. Um, none as large as this one. However, I think it allowed me to feel confident in this emergent situation. And my three big takeaways are one, leveraging the disaster. So if the problem needs to be solved quickly, to make decisions that are the most efficient for you and your team and the future health of your collection. And in support of that, takeaway number two, conducting these trials and processes so that you have data and information to communicate to administration that you have thought thoughtfully in as much time as you have been allowed to into these processes, and here are the data and here's the number. So come in with a strong offense. And as you're conducting trials and collecting data, reaching out to organizations who have done this before, who have documentation, who have policies, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel in sort of a time of crises. So I look forward to any questions that you have later. And now I will pass the mic to Lisa.